My plea here is, if you have children or grandchildren, I think our way of life should be preserved. So we have to prioritize defense. Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte. How to understand Mark Rutte's sudden call for a NATO military buildup. After 1991, almost everyone believed the threat from Moscow was over. Some of us knew, of course, that Moscow still wanted Europe, that Moscow had a long-range strategy. Evidence has piled up in recent years that the KGB and underground CPSU apparatus maintained control of many post-Soviet governments and economies into the 1990s and beyond. And then there are the secret communist structures left behind in every Warsaw Pact country. Nobody ever mentions this, or puts two and two together. It is no small thing, as well, that Russian President Boris Yeltsin met with Bill Clinton in late 1999 and asked Clinton to give Europe to Russia. This conversation was only declassified a few years ago, and it tells us why Russia gave up the Warsaw Pact in the first place. And who even noticed this incredible bit of conversation between the Russian president and his American counterpart. The Russian idea was to end the Cold War and provoke the West into disarming, into living a carefree life. The Russian strategists thought that if they pulled out of Europe, the Americans would go back across the Atlantic and stop building nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, the Russians would continue building new classes of nuclear weapons and missiles, together with the Chinese. Later, when Russia resumed the Cold War, Kremlin troops could enter Europe easily. The Americans, snug on the other side of the Atlantic, would be reluctant to go back into Europe. As it happened, of course, the West stopped making nuclear weapons. However, NATO did not dissolve. The Americans did not leave Europe. Of course, military budgets were neglected throughout the free world, and the so-called war against terror caused a tremendous wastage, a tremendous expenditure of conventional resources. At the same time, Western companies poured money and technology into China while Russia kept much of the USSR's nuclear arsenal intact. And when Putin started revitalizing Russia's arms industries and launched an incursion into Georgia, most NATO countries shrugged. No serious military preparations were made. When Ukraine threw out its Russian puppet government in 2014, in the Revolution of Dignity, Russia annexed Crimea and invaded Donbass. Yet Europe still did not begin rearmament. In fact, President Obama mocked Russia as a regional power. Then, in 2022, Russia opened a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That was almost 3 years ago. But even then, NATO did not use the time to rearm. So why is NATO's General Secretary finally sounding the alarm? What intelligence information has him so worried? We are not ready for what is coming our way in 4 to 5 years, Rutte said. This begs a question. What is coming in 4 or 5 years? Where does this projection come from? In a recent conversation with a retired U.S. 4-star general, I learned that Russia and China will reach peak strength relative to the West in 4 or 5 years. I believe this fact, with all its devastating implications, forms the basis of Rutte's projection. How does the West close the gap? The answer is obvious. Europe's economy is larger than America's, yet they spend much less on defense. President-elect Trump says this must change. In relation to this, General Secretary Rutte said, Donald Trump was completely right when in his first term he forced us to spend more. Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine is not over. Russia is dramatically increasing its defense spending while North Korea has joined the fight. Will there be peace talks next year? 5 days ago, the Kremlin reacted to Trump's call for peace talks. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, "Our position on Ukraine is well known. The conditions for an immediate stop of hostilities were set out by President Putin in his speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry in June of this year. It is important to recall that it was Ukraine that refused and continues to refuse negotiations." Here is the core of Putin's speech on June 14, 2024. The world is changing rapidly. Global politics, the economy, and technological competition will never be the same as before. The countries of the global South and East are gaining prominence, and the role of Africa and Latin America is growing. Since Soviet times, we have always acknowledged the importance of these regions, but today the dynamics have completely shifted. The pace of transformation in Eurasia has also accelerated significantly. This new political and economic reality now serves as the foundation for the emerging multipolar and multilateral world order, and this is an inevitable process. It reflects the cultural and civilization's diversity that is inherently part of humanity, despite all attempts at artificial unification. These profound, system-wide changes certainly inspire optimism and hope because the establishment of multipolarity and multilateralism in international affairs, including respect for international law and broad representation, make it possible to resolve the most complex problems together for the common benefit, and to build mutually beneficial relations and cooperation between sovereign states for the sake of well-being and security of peoples. Such a vision for the future aligns with the aspirations of the vast majority of countries. This is evident in the work of BRICS. Under the Russian chairmanship this year, we will facilitate the smooth inclusion of new BRICS members in the association's working bodies. Blah, blah, blah. The potential of BRICS, blah. The crisis involving Ukraine is not a conflict between two states or peoples stemming from issues between them. If that were the case, there is no doubt that Russians and Ukrainians, united by a shared history and culture, would have found a fair resolution to any disputes and disagreements. Putin tells his version of the Ukraine conflict. Then Putin claims the Bucha massacre was a provocation. I repeat our firm stance. Ukraine should adopt a neutral, non-aligned status, be nuclear-free, and undergo demilitarization and denazification. These parameters were broadly agreed upon during the Istanbul negotiations in 2022, including specific details on demilitarization. Certainly, the rights, freedoms, and interests of Russian-speaking citizens in Ukraine must be fully protected. The new territorial realities, including the status of Crimea, Sevastopol, Donetsk, and Lugansk People's Republics, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia regions as part of the Russian Federation, should be acknowledged. These foundational principles need to be formalized through fundamental international agreements in the future. Naturally, this entails the removal of all Western sanctions against Russia as well. Denazification is the Kremlin's code language for a total Ukrainian surrender. To propose this is insulting to the Ukrainians. Has Trump gotten Putin to soften his position? Dmitry Peskov says no. Perhaps there will be no peace talks after all.